I'd like to welcome everyone to this event on feminist principles in governance, hosted by Lawyers Against Poverty, where we welcome former chair of ActionAid UK, Patti Whaley, to share her insights on how these principles can transform into positive changes in professional spaces. For those of you who are new to LAP, we're a new charity and a growing movement of lawyers and members of the wider legal community around the world, committed to using our skills, passions, and wider resources to contribute to the alleviation of poverty. Our members do this in a number of ways, whether contributing to our Justice Fund to support critical or strategic legal interventions worldwide, or offering their time to support one of our programs, be that through mentoring, capacity building for human rights defenders, or running legal confidence sessions for members of the refugee community in the UK. If you'd like to find out more about LAP, and we very much hope that you do, then just visit our website and get in touch. But I'd like now to introduce our speaker for this evening, an expert in the field, Patti Whaley. Patti has been a passionate advocate in the social justice sector for the last 30 years, supporting the development of organisations including Amnesty, the British Institute for Human Rights, Safe Passage, and ActionAid UK. We're particularly delighted to have Patti here this evening because it was a few years ago that ActionAid UK decided that its governance and operations should be guided by feminist principles in an effort to transform the power dynamics within the organisation and develop a more cooperative model of working. As ActionAid's chair until 2019, Patti was integral to this process and joins us this evening to introduce us to the core feminist principles, discuss what a feminist model of governance looks like and how it has since developed. So with that, and with a warm thank you, I'll pass over to Patti. Welcome, Patti.
Thank you, Emma. Thank you. It's a pleasure to be invited to speak here, and congratulations to all of you on launching Lawyers Against Poverty as an independent charity. I am going to talk about how feminist principles were implemented at ActionAid, and then talk you through what we call the top 10 principles of feminist leadership. I hope you all received a handout of these. I'm not a lawyer myself. I have had some exposure perhaps to the type of work that Lawyers Against Poverty does because at Safe Passage, which is one of my trustee roles, we do strategic litigation on how to open legal routes for unaccompanied child refugees to be reunited with family members. So I have some, let's say, indirect, perhaps, understanding of the kind of work that you might do. And I that poverty and injustice are manifestations of entrenched power and privilege. Then changing that power and privilege has to start with ourselves. We have to be open to the kind of change that we want to enact in the world. Hopefully that you have that in common with us, that as you work to confront poverty and exclusion in your own work, both that understanding of the importance of power and the desire to have in your own organization the kind of change you want to create in the world will have resonance with Lawyers Against Poverty. So this was what led ActionAid back in 2003 to change itself from a traditional neo-colonial development organization with a UK headquarters that owned all of the country programs into a federation of independent country programs with its headquarters in South Africa. We basically just gave away ownership of everything outside of the UK so that countries could run their own anti-poverty programs. And we're now one member of that federation. It's been a successful change for us, not perfect, not always easy. We're still working to make it better. But overall, we feel like it's been a success. The board also did a lot of work on its own diversity. When I was initially treasurer and then vice chair of ActionAid. And during that period, we recruited a Black woman as chair. We always had a board member from one of our African or Asian members cross-posted to our own board. And we recruited our first pair of young trustees under 25. That gave us a more diverse board, but boards often recruit different people to the board and find that their dynamic of board behavior doesn't change because the underlying assumptions about whose voice counts and who gets heard haven't really changed. And this is where the interest in feminist leadership came in. As I'm sure you know, feminist theory is intensely interested in understanding who has power and how that power is exercised. At board level, that means things like who sets the agenda of items that come before the board, who speaks first when a topic comes in, who gets heard the most. Are the important decisions taken inside the room or in little clusters over the coffee break? Am I treating you as an equal? And do you feel free to tell me if you disagree? This pushes you to look beyond policies and procedures at root behaviors and underlying assumptions. I'm sure you've heard stories about organizations that have exemplary policies and procedures, but because they don't change the underlying power dynamics, nothing really changes. We've heard, for example, about organizations that have vowed to eradicate sexual abuse, but where the victims and observers of that abuse are still afraid to speak up. We wanted to make real behavioral change at ActionAid, not just recruit different people to the board, but leave the existing power assumptions in place. Parallel with this, our secretariat in South Africa was developing these top 10 feminist principles. There wasn't a real guidebook about how to use these. We pretty much had to think through them ourselves and figure out what they meant for us at board level. So I'm going to talk through them, but let me first say three overall points about how they work. First of all, to a certain extent, these principles, often they just strike people as, responsible management, like what's so feminist about them? It's important as you read them to hold that context of power analysis quite firmly in your head. What you're trying to do with these is confront power, either your own or someone else's, and ensure that that power is used in a constructive and inclusive way. And in doing that, you commit to letting go of the idea that I'm always right or my idea is always the best. But in addition to that, many of these points also have specific resonance with the way women and minorities have been excluded in the past, or the way women sometimes undermine their own power. And when you wrap all that together, you get a package that gives you a culture that should be more explicitly aware of power and how it's being used, whether it's being used for exclusion or inclusion. The second thing is, I'm often asked, do you have to use the word feminist when you talk about these? Such an alienating word. And I tend to say, yes, you have to call them feminist, because what you're doing when you call them feminist is reminding yourself, this is not just about being better managers or better board members. It's about committing to a practice of actively sharing power. We're not saying that women have to be first. We're not trying to blame men or exclude men. We're just trying to remind ourselves that we're trying to change a system that's built on historic privilege. And if we're not willing to acknowledge that privilege, we can't change it. And because systemic privilege is least visible to the people who possess it, we need to continually acknowledge that and remind ourselves and reaffirm that commitment to actively use that power in a more inclusive way, which is obviously a commitment that both men and women can make. The third thing, just to point out generally, is although we call these feminist principles, because of that reflection in that origin in feminist power analysis, it's not meant to limit us to changing power just on behalf of women. We're trying to change power for and with everyone who's been excluded, whether that's because of race, class, sexuality, disability, age, any other aspect of identity. There's a great quote in Rennie Edo-Lodge's book, Why I'm No Longer Talking to White People About Race. She says, feminism is not about equality just for women. Feminism at its best is a movement that works to liberate all people who have been economically, socially, and culturally marginalized. That means disabled people, Black people, trans people, working class people. It means feminism will have won when we have ended poverty. I really liked that explanation of it. So with that in mind, let's go through the 10 principles, and please start to think how they would apply to your work, whether that's within running Lawyers Against Poverty itself, or your work with your local projects, your partners, your beneficiaries, the people that you seek to influence. So the first one is self-awareness, accepting our vulnerabilities, recognizing our strengths. ActionAid has two statements of these. One is the more objective one at the top, and then the restatement in italics is how you would state it more personally. But they're both valid. They're quite similar, but I thought I would give you both of them. For me, particularly, this one, in trying to be a better anti-racist and in trying to talk about American politics, a lot of this focuses for me on trying not to be defensive or unwilling to admit when I might be wrong, or just basically focus too much on my own ego protection. But at the same time, women have a tendency to undervalue themselves, and we also need to work against that. For those of us accustomed to talking a lot, or talking in an adversarial context, it's often about monitoring how you're listening. There's a fascinating phrase I learned lately called predatory listening. That is, listening with the objective of figuring out the best way to attack what the other person is saying, as opposed to listening with a view towards understanding that other person's point of view. And that's one of the things that you work to become more aware of in this value. If we go to the next one, self-care. Well, nearly everyone in the nonprofit sector has to struggle against the tendency to work long hours. And I hear rumors that this can be a bit of an issue in the legal profession as well. But it also particularly affects women because they more often have the greater share of unpaid care work. On the ActionAid board, a lot of us were semi-retired, or at least gotten to a stage in life where we could control our own schedules. When we recruited 2 university students, we had to reassess what demands we were making on each other and take more care not to overburden the people that weren't so flexible with their time, so that they could participate and not feel guilty that they didn't do everything that perhaps some other people did, but that they were free to contribute according to their own schedule and make them feel comfortable with that as well. The third one is on dismantling bias. That is, checking our own privilege and power, whether that relates to gender, class, ability, or other factors. Privilege is so pervasive, and it takes such constant vigilance, partly because it's so hard to see your own privilege. This can be as simple as making sure everyone gets heard and that people's voices count, whether or not they're the traditionally powerful voices. Keeping in mind, for example, that if you're a British lawyer, you are almost by definition, I would think, in a position of privilege relative to, for example, your local partners and beneficiaries. I was also thinking recently when the Yorkshire Ripper died and the stories of how his victims were treated came into the newspaper, I thought how different the investigation of those crimes might have been if the police had not made assumptions about what kind of victims the women were, but they were not aware of their own power and the assumptions that they made, the biases that they had towards these women, and how much it affected the investigation of that case. The fourth one is inclusion. Inclusion means building a diverse team, not just including people, but taking active steps to enable everyone to participate as fully as they are able. I remember a clever maneuver from my Amnesty International days that applies here. When the national directors met every year, there was usually an automatic tendency for the wealthy northern directors to dominate the meeting. And one of the things we tried in an effort to counterbalance this was by having the southern directors start the meeting a day early. So by the time the northerners arrived, the southerners had already had a chance to get a conversation going amongst themselves. They were already on a roll, and it kind of counterbalanced the traditional power differences between those two groups of directors. Another technique we used at board level, because there's a tendency for the first person who speaks on a question to have a disproportionate amount of influence, you sometimes take particular steps to counteract that. For example, if you ask people to write down what they think about an issue before anyone speaks, they're less likely to be swayed by that first speaker. Or you use different techniques for picking who starts first. For example, just going from the chair counterclockwise, rather than taking the first person who raises their hand. So there are all sorts of active ways that you develop to make sure that everyone gets a chance to be heard equally. The next one is sharing power, creating space for other people to lead, particularly those people who may not be the usual suspects or may not have the confidence to put themselves forward, or who have traditionally not been at the forefront. For Northern-led NGOs, it's still hard to get past the assumption that we really know best how things should be done, and our procedures are the ones that should be followed. ActionAid had a whole set of detailed do's and don'ts about how to implement these principles, and this is where one of my favorites came up, the one that says, if you are always the smartest person in the room, you have utterly failed as a feminist leader. I always try to remember that because it amuses me, but it's very true. And then the next one is responsible and transparent use of power. Yes, thank you. A lot of this relates not just to what decisions are made, but how they were made, who is involved in the decision, and whether we're open and transparent about what factors entered into that decision. Or as it's often expressed, the integrity of the process of getting to a decision can be as important as the decision itself. Next one, please. Accountable collaboration is about ensuring that collective goals are clearly defined and mutually owned, and holding ourselves and others accountable for achieving them. I think in a way, this is the one that was the biggest challenge for ActionAid. We had really tried to have mutual accountability, for example, between the Northern fundraising offices and the Southern program offices. But in practice, the demands of donors and the requirements of UK regulation about things like you must have an anti-terrorist funding policy, and you must have a child protection policy, and you must have this policy and that policy, all of which are good policies. But the process of imposing those on the rest of, on the program offices, and just the power inherent in money itself often made it feel like accountability just flowed one way. This is a real challenge, and I think one that the organization is still struggling with. You can give away political power, but if you still have financial power, it's difficult to escape that completely. So this was one that we're still very much in the process of working on. The next one is respectful feedback, seeking and valuing constructive feedback as an opportunity for two-way learning. At ActionAid, the default mode for giving feedback in annual appraisals of staff or trustees was that all feedback would be attributed. It would not be anonymous unless there was some special reason why it should be. That doesn't mean all feedback was positive. It just meant that it all had to be respectful. Giving and accepting constructive feedback is a real skill. And again, you always have to keep in mind the power balance between the giver and the receiver of feedback, and try to make sure that that doesn't corrupt the feedback process itself. The ninth one is courage. Taking initiative, learning from mistakes, not fearing failure. It has to do not only with the courage to try new things and take reasonable risks, but also the courage to admit to mistakes and learn from them. On our board, it often meant the courage to explore disagreement in a group that really got along very well and had a very powerful wish to be agreeable. We had to learn to work to be more comfortable with disagreement and just to sit with it and explore it and not move too quickly to consensus, because that can cut off having a good discussion. Finally, the last one is zero tolerance, calling out any form of discrimination and abuse of power. I hope this one pretty much speaks to itself, but the fact that it's obvious doesn't mean it's always easy, whether it has to do with confronting your own behavior or the behavior of other people. That's the set of 10. I hope there's a lot of content there that gets you thinking, and that it all makes sense, and that you start to see some ways that this would play out in your own work. And if we go to the next slide, I think there'll be another summary of the whole 10. Yeah. I should also just say in closing that while I think adopting a feminist approach to leadership is a great move, it's much more like a community of practice than an out-of-the-box solution. It's a framework within which you address challenges, but it doesn't necessarily make those challenges any easier. It may sometimes make them harder. The principles, I think, can be quite transformative, but it's not because they magically point the way to the right answer every time. They're transformative more because communities where people build power together are stronger than communities where power is held by a few people. They're particularly transformative when they tie closely to your organizational mission and your theory of change, which they certainly did for ActionAid, and I hope they will also do for Lawyers Against Poverty.